good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us online or in person here. I am not Shane. I am Ed, and so don't expect Shane, expect Ed. So whatever that means. So this morning we're going to be continuing our study in 1 Kings. We'll be mostly in chapter 15 this morning. Have you ever thought about the phrase, have you ever heard the phrase, the past is the present? Have you ever heard that phrase? So basically what that means is that basically that we are defined not just by this moment, we are defined by the things that lead up to this moment. That we can't escape the things that have happened in the past. That the example the writer gave was, or dreams. We don't dream about the future, we dream about what happened the day before that. Because even though it's in the past, it's still present in our minds. So the past, it defines who we are today. So you're an accumulation, this is kind of how I paraphrased it, you're an accumulation of all the events of your past. And to reverse the path that you've been on can sometimes be very difficult and very challenging. Everybody agree with that? I mean, there's extreme examples of addiction, things like that, because you decided that you were going to take a substance, addictive substance. That can be your entire future, can be changed completely because of that. And it's hard to change. So our past does define who we are today, but it doesn't have to truly define the future. We can change, but it's not an easy path. So past experiences, they still exist in us in some form or fashion. Past actions are about organizations and groups. Why do you belong to a group? Because of what your past experiences are, what your passions are. So that may be your identity. You may be a let's say, what's a group? Shriner. Okay, let's just use a Shriner. You may be a Shriner, and you identify with that. And people ask you about who you are. You'll say, "Well, I have this job, this that, and I belong to the Shriners." And so that defines who we are. So creating a new identity when we're comfortable with the old identity is difficult. The old identity. That's a hard word. Identity. Never knew that. The old identity may be why they joined in the first place. So this morning we're studying King Asa, and he faced the past, and he took action to change the direction, not just of himself, but of Judah. And to do that, there's a lot of work involved, and he had to make some changes. Now, who was Asa? So he was the third king of Judah. Remember that there was the split. Israel was the northern kingdom, and Judah was the southern kingdom. He was the third king in Judah, and the kings preceding him were not really good kings. We know Solomon, he started off as a good king, and he kind of faded over time. And we've learned in the past couple of weeks about, if you go down the list of the kings, you'll say this king was a bad king, this king was a bad king, this king was a bad king. Oh, here's a good one. And then there's another list of 4 or 5 bad kings, and here's one who followed God. So there were more kings who did not follow God in these days than there were who did follow God. Asa was the 5th king in the line of King David, so he wasn't in the line. So that tells you this is still really close to David's kingdom. And they believe that he reigned around 910 BC to 869. So basically, they're saying close to 40 years was his reign. So let's start out with some background here. So Abijam was the king after Rehoboam. Rehoboam was the first king of Judah, and then Abijam succeeded him. He reigned for only 3 years. And it says he continued his father's evil ways instead of following the spiritual example of David, which we see happens over and over again. The wars that began between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continued when Abijam was king. And when Asa took over, he had peace for about 10 years. He became king following his father's death. And it says in 1 Kings 15:9, he followed the Lord faithfully and took steps to undo evil practices Rehoboam and Abijam had done. He also honored the Lord by bringing consecrated gifts into the temple. And this is what we're going to be looking at this morning. So he led the people in a time of national renewal and military victories as well. He faced a lot of pressures, especially from Israel, the northern kingdom. We're going to read about how there was a town called Ramah, and that the northern kingdom tried to defeat the southern kingdom by fortifying that, which was an important trade route to and from. So they basically, the southern kingdom was cut off because of, that town was no longer accessible to them. In the northern kingdom, Jeroboam's son Nadab was a king for about 2 years. And his general conspired against him and struck him down, and then took over as the king. He destroyed Jeroboam's entire household, but was Basha any better at following God? No, he was another example of an evil king. The prophet Jehu was the son of Hanani, pronounced judgment against Basha for his wickedness. And of course, the prophet's words came true. And Basha's son, Elah, reigned only 2 years before one of his military leaders killed him and became king. I was going to say it's really tough to be king. I would not want to be king. Like, people are getting knocked off left and right when they're kings. And he struck down Basha's entire household and eliminated his family line, which was prophesied by Jehu's prophecy earlier, what is mentioned. Zimri, he reigned 7 days. That was a long reign. He faced trouble from Omri, one of his army commanders, and instead of confronting him, he took his own life. So then Omri became king of Israel. Omri reigned 12 years, and he actually built Samaria on there, which we've heard about Samaria a lot, even in Jesus' time. There was a lot of things happened in Samaria. And he established that as the northern kingdom's capital city. However, guess what? Omri followed his predecessor's bad spiritual example, committed evil against the Lord, and encouraged adultery. So when when Omri died, his son Ahab took over Asa's throne. And that's a lot of I know a lot of names, a lot of backstory, but I mean, you can see kind of the turmoil that was in Israel and Judah during this time. All right, so let's start out verses 9 and 10. In the 20th year of Israel's king Jeroboam, Asa became king of Judah, and he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His grandmother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. So like I said, the 20th year of Jeroboam's reign was 910 BC. So Ahijah, I said that wrong. Asheba, sorry guys, everybody listen, you can correct me on the pronunciation, had told Jeroboam, God will make his kingdom great like King David's, if Jeroboam followed God faithfully. So any guesses? Did Jeroboam actually follow God faithfully like he was supposed to? Any guesses based on the history of the kings? No. He took the northern kingdom in a bad direction, and he actually disrupted the unity between Israel and Judah. He set up golden calves at Dan and Bethel and urged the people to worship them instead of going all the way to Jerusalem. He also allowed non-Levites to serve as priests and changed the date of one of the fall feasts God had commanded. So he was taking a lot of things, following his own guidance and not following the Lord's guidance. So when Asa became king of Judah, the southern kingdom was in a really bad spot, and they really needed a good spiritual example. Asa's father and grandfather had both followed evil paths, as had Solomon at the end of his reign. So Asa, he reigned 41 years, and during his time, there was mostly stability in Judah. You see, why do you think they mentioned his grandmother's name was Maacah, daughter of Absalom? Why do you think she's mentioned in here? The grandmother could mean either mother or it could mean grandmother. But basically, it's showing the line that continued from David. And that's why she's mentioned there, because that's how we know that how the relation came down the line. Just the word father can mean ancestor or son or descendant. So there's a lot of multiple uses for some of those words. All right, let's move on to verses 11 through 15. Asa did what was right in the Lord's sight, as his ancestor David had done. He banished the male cult prostitutes from the land and removed all the idols that his ancestors had made. He also removed his grandmother Maacah from being queen mother because she had made an obscene image of Asherah. Asa chopped down her obscene image and burned it in the Kidron Valley. The high places were not taken away, but Asa was wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his entire life. He brought his father's consecrated gifts and his own consecrated gifts into the Lord's temple, silver, gold, and utensils. All right. So here's where we see the writer of Kings here says, Asa did what was right in the Lord's sight. The word right can be also interpreted as being just, being upright. So basically he listened to God and did what God had asked him to do, for the most part, as we'll see. And it means basically staying on the straight path, that he was on the straight path that the Lord had set out for him. So it says, Asa served the Lord well as his ancestor David had done. So he was the first one mentioned that actually followed David's legacy to that extent. Even Solomon, who was, we know him for his wisdom, fell off that path and didn't follow David as closely as you would expect, based on what we kind of think of him as. We always think of Solomon as being such a great king, and he was for quite a while, but he did, as we studied a few weeks ago, he did kind of veer off the path and not keep the straight path near the end of his reign. So we're talking about him being on the straight path, and that's a contrast to the unfaithfulness of the previous kings, Abijam, Rehoboam, and even Solomon. David encouraged Solomon to follow the Lord faithfully so God would fulfill the covenant he had made. He began well but didn't finish well. So Rehoboam and Abijam, they did evil. But Asa, to his credit, was determined to take hold of the promise that God had made them and to take Judah from this downward spiral, which had been on as well as the northern kingdom of Israel was on that same spiral. Okay, so what steps does Asa need to take to get them back on track? What was going on at this time? There was intermarrying, there was a lot of idol worship, there were very strange sexual practices amongst the people, things that would, like, even today would kind of blow our mind a little bit, some of the things that they were doing in that time. I mean, some really crazy stuff was going on. So the first thing was that it turned the people back from adultery. So what does adultery mean? Basically it means worshiping any idol other than the one true God. Anything other than the one true God that you're worshiping would be considered an idol. So first, it says he banished the male cult prostitutes from the land. So there were apparently plenty of men who were, don't ask me why, don't ask me how, but they were, kind of, don't want to think about it, but, but they were kind of selling their bodies, and this was a pretty common practice in Judah in the day. They somehow thought that was worship, right? Yeah. But, where is it in the law or anything about this? Anything? Ten Commandments, anything in there about doing that? Not supposed to do it. Exactly. So this is really far from, this tells you how the debauchery was, for lack of a better word, at the time in there. So they did that as part of like you said, their rites as part of their worship. The Lord had warned his people through Moses not to do these things. So it wasn't like there was ambiguity about whether this was right or wrong. In Deuteronomy, it talks about prostitution and this kind of worship. So but once God's people settled in the land, they began to worship Baal, Asherah, and their practices. So the first thing Asa did was rid the land of the prostitutes. He provided sex as a part of pagan worship. Second, it says he removed all the idols that his ancestors had made. In Chronicles parallels a lot of this. And Chronicles, you can read about how Solomon and Rehoboam had both made idols to worship. So Asa knew that he needed to encourage people to worship God, but that wasn't enough. You have to remove the temptation that they faced on a daily basis. It's hard not to do something when it's right in your face all the time, right? That's like anything that you're addicted to. You don't help a cigarette to somebody who's trying to quit smoking. Hey, here's a pack of cigarettes. I'm gonna leave them here in front of you, and back later. I mean, you just don't do that. You don't put temptations in there. He also took other actions. It says he had to take action against a member of his own family. Remember his grandmother? We talked about why she was mentioned. Well, she was the queen mother, which could have been grandmother or could have been his actual mother. And he basically kicked her out. He basically said, "You no longer have any part of my not the kingdom, but no part of being in my ruling family or having any influence on anyone." Because she built an obscene image of an Asherah, which is the Canaanite goddess of fertility. And the word translated, it says here, means obscene image. And the root word means to shudder. So imagine how bad this idol was that she had made. That you look at it, it made your skin crawl, basically, was how bad this idol was. And he wanted to emphasize how awful it was to make an idol like this. And so that's why he kind of separated himself from her and pushed her aside as far as being in the day-to-day of the ruling family. The goddess Asherah was represented by a wooden pole. It says he chopped down her obscene image and burned it in the Kidron Valley. And he probably did this in a public way so that all the kingdom could see that he was serious about making these changes and bringing Judah back to the Lord. Kidron Valley is actually, for reference, is just a little bit east of Jerusalem. And if we talk about the Mount of Olives, it was actually right between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem itself. So it was just right outside the city. It says the high places were not taken away. So this is where Asa wasn't 100% in line with God's will. High places there were plenty of sites throughout the land where they would go to worship. Moses told the people when they entered the land they were to offer sacrifices only at the places the Lord chose. However, God's people were sacrificing on other high places when Solomon became king, and continued to do so under the other kings. And so Asa did not have them stop this practice. He actually allowed that to continue to worship in places that weren't necessarily in God's plan. So in that case, he was not fully following God's command. Nevertheless, as we continue to read, Asa was wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord for his entire life. So apparently God was okay with some minor missteps on his part because of where his heart was. The next line is, Asa brought his father's consecrated gifts and his own consecrated gifts to the Lord's temple. Now, silver, gold, and utensils. So these were consecrated gifts, which means these gifts were set apart for use by God, dedicated to God, not to be used for other purposes. So this is a desire to have these gifts set aside for the Lord's service. To set apart basically means to become holy, which is kind of what the term we use a little more, is to make something holy, which means unblemished and pure. So Asa brought the gold, silver, and utensils to the Lord's temple, and he dedicated them for service. Again, these actions testify that he was determined to follow the Lord. What does God expect from us and for other leaders, especially leaders? Leaders are held more accountable, the Scripture says, than just the people who follow the leaders. God expects leaders to follow him wholeheartedly. Leaders who set good examples can have a profound influence over those they lead. But what's the flip side of that? Leaders who set bad examples can also have really strong influences over the people they lead. So that is why being a leader, you're judged more harshly as a leader if you do something that's not in God's will. The Bible encourages the church to pray for their leaders, because doing so does what? It helps the entire church. When Pastor Tim is on the right path, the chances of the church being on the right path are way higher than they would be otherwise. But we all need to be on that same path, so nobody's excused. All right, so let's move on to verses 16 through 19. So verse 16, there was war between Asa and King Basha of Israel throughout their reigns. Israel's king Basha went to war against Judah. He built Ramah in order to keep anyone from leaving or coming to King Asa of Judah. So Asa withdrew all the silver and gold that remained in the treasuries of the Lord's temple and the treasuries of the royal palace, and gave it to his servants. Then King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabrimim, son of Hezion, king of Aram, who lived in Damascus, saying, there is a treaty between me and you, between my father and your father. Look, I have sent you a gift of silver and gold. Go and break your treaty with King Basha of Israel, so that he will withdraw from me. All right, we talked about the conflict between the northern and southern kingdoms. So at this point in time was one of those times where the war had flared up. Basha had become king 3 years into Asa's reign. He reigned 24 years, so both of these were pretty long-term kings. The war between these two kings occurred several times over time, though it does say Asa enjoyed peace for the first 10 years. So Basha was an evil king and did not follow the Lord. So another one in these line of leaders of Israel and Judah who did not follow the Lord. On one occasion, when Israel's king Basha went to war against Judah, Basha's attack had some impact and left Asa in a vulnerable position. So he built this town of Ramah, which is like a fortress, in order to keep anyone from leaving or coming to King Asa of Judah. Remember earlier we talked about in the introduction how that was like the main supply line, the main crossroads for trade into and out of Judah. So Israel has basically built this keep, and now it's really hurting Judah as far as their livelihood, as far as their prosperity. It was about 5 miles north of Jerusalem, and it was near the southern border of Israel. This was also Samuel's hometown and where he was buried, as a side note. This area was strategic because it was a major north-south highway and a major east-west highway ran directly through it. Thus, when Basha took over this and started fortifying it, he blocked the key passageway. He cut off trade and communication with Judah, and so Asa had a difficult time traveling to northwest or to the Mediterranean coast or north to the Jordan Valley, all because of this one spot that Israel had taken control of. So this was a pretty desperate thing for Asa. he knew that he could not survive. They could not survive if they were blocked in this way. The kingdom couldn't. So he took all the silver and gold that remained in the treasury of the temple. He added to it the treasures of the royal palace. He took it and gave it to his servants, which are some of his advisors. And then he dispatched them to Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram. Now, Aram was to the north of Israel. So this is the other side, so this is the opposite direction. Right now, Israel and Judah are fighting on Israel's southern border and Jordan's northern border. But so Aram is on Israel's northern border, so exact opposite side. So the king, he sent his servants to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram. And he sent a message with all the gold and silver and all the treasures that he sent. He reminded him that he had a treaty between me and you, between my father and your father. We don't know anything about that treaty, really. Just that's the only time it's ever mentioned in Scripture. But there was a covenant apparently between Judah and Aram. So at any rate, Asa's plan was to ask Ben-Hadad to help. So he said, look, I have sent you a gift of silver and gold. Or another word for that would be maybe a bribe, which it probably was more in line with a bribe. It wasn't a gift given with no reason, like what a gift should be, but it was, I'll give you this to do this. So the money wasn't really a gift. So Asa urged Ben-Hadad to break whatever treaty he had with Israel so that he will withdraw from me. So after Solomon, the nation of Israel was in two parts. Again, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. And Israel lay between Judah and Aram. Israel's king was in the midst of trying to attack Judah. But Asa knew that if Ben-Hadad attacked from the north, that Israel would have to withdraw to defend the northern border. So basically, it's really hard to fight wars on two completely different fronts. As you can, historically, you can see that from lots of wars. But if you can't defend, it's really hard to defend both because you basically got to either split your forces or just pick which one you're actually going to fight and try to just defend the other one. So this is kind of Asa not really trusting the Lord to protect Judah, even though he's been trying to honor the Lord. It's just another part of him trying to take matters into his own hands. It says he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. Nevertheless, he chose to trust a foreign nation to save him rather than trusting the Lord to save him. And in Chronicles, the prophet Hanani will rebuke Asa and say for his lack of faith in God and trust in God. But it says God allowed Asa's actions, but then we don't know what God would have done, what blessings he would have put on Judah if he would have just followed God and not tried to take matters in his own hands. So it says in here, believers must guard their hearts when they face difficulties. So it's so easy to try to solve an issue that falls outside of God's plan. So easy to try to figure it out for ourselves, or if we see an opportunity, we have an idea we think might work, instead of waiting for God to act, we act on it ourselves. That's a very, very human nature kind of thing to do. But God calls on us to trust him rather than pursuing actions that may be less ideal or ethical. When we face difficulties, first step, it says here in the text, we should pray, perhaps seek counsel from godly people, wise other believers, and only proceed when we are convinced that this is the course of action that God would have wanted us to follow. There are lots of things in this world today that we would kind of feel desperation and try to take things into our own hands. I mean, the list is long of seeing something happening, and we feel the need to stop it before it gets very far, but instead just praying about it first, letting God handle it. So it can be very difficult to trust in challenging situations. But it really shouldn't be, because as Christians, we know, we've already seen so many times where He has taken care of us when things are desperate, when we don't know what's going to happen. All right, so moving on to verse 20 and 21. Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa and sent the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel. He attacked Ajon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Makkah, Al-Chenereth, and the whole land of Naphtali. When Basha heard about it, he quit building Ramah and stayed in Tirzah. Okay, so Ben-Hadad took the bribe, basically, and said, okay, I like what you've offered me, I'm going to do this. And he went ahead and he sent his commanders against the northern cities of Israel. He attacked Ajon, which is right on the northern frontier, the city of Dan, which is about 7 miles to the southeast of Ajon, which is an ancient city. The city of Abel-Beth-Makkah, it was about 5 miles northwest of Dan. I know I need a map to kind of bounce around on here. And Al-Chenereth is the region around the Sea of Galilee, which also sat on the northwestern shore. So you can see all these places that they're being attacked from the north now instead of focusing on the south with Judah. So today, the Sea of Galilee is called Kinneret, which I never even knew that until I read this. So if you hear about Lake Kinneret or the Kinneret Sea, that's actually the Sea of Galilee today. When the name means zither, which is a stringed instrument, which it resembles apparently. So these cities are a significant part of the whole land of Naphtali. Much of the territory lay above the Sea of Galilee and down to it. So when Ben-Hadad attacked this region, Basha knew he had to respond, that he would lose his country if he didn't defend the northern border, or at least a large portion of it. So Asa's strategy achieved its purpose. When Basha heard about it, he quit building Ramah, which is, remember, he's fortifying against Judah to cut off the trade and travel, and he stayed in Tirzah. It was one of the Northern Kingdom's capitals. They've had a few over the time. So we don't know exactly what Basha did to defend himself against Ben-Hadad. The writer here says perhaps the retreat from Ramah enabled him to push back on the northern border, or perhaps he just had to perhaps he lost a lot of territory doing that. We just don't really know. In verse 22, then King Asa gave a command to everyone without exception in Judah. They carried away the stones of Ramah and the timbers Basha had built with it. Then King Asa built Gibeah of Benjamin and Mishpah with them. All right, so Israel has retreated back from trying to fortify against Judah. So as soon as Israel vacated that area, then Judah came pouring back in, and they carried away everything that had been built. They took it other places. They took the timbers and the stones and removed the barricade that had blocked their trade and blocked their ability to travel, and he opened up the highways again. Then King Asa built Gibeah with the stones they had taken from Ramah. And Gibeah lay to the north of Ramah, and it was a part of Benjamin's territory in the days of Joshua. And it was one of the holy cities that for the Levites. And Mizpah lay just north of Gibeah, so he's kind of building up a little bit. And that was where Saul was actually crowned king over Israel. So by fortifying Geba and Mizpah north of Ramah, Asa was protecting his own interest, and he restrained Basha from attacking him again. So it says, overall, Asa was a good king who wholeheartedly followed the Lord. Nevertheless, in these instances, he chose to trust his own strategy rather than God's protection. The Bible also notes that Asa developed a foot disease during his final years, and instead of asking God to help him, he consulted the physicians, which is another thing that's talked about in 2 Chronicles. There's a lot of parallels in 2 Chronicles and this. I almost recommend reading kind of both at the same time, just to they have different information in each of the two books. So overall, it says Asa received a favorable judgment from the writer of Kings. He stopped Judah's spiral into sin, and he got rid of the idols. He got rid of the prostitution and the pagan worship, and he turned Judah back into the direction that God wanted them in. So getting back to the beginning point, how hard is it to turn away from the path you're on, to not let the past be your present, to make a new start? It's hard. What did Asa have to do here? He had to confront all his people and their practices, things they had gotten used to doing. I mean, they don't talk about it much, but there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of people who made their livelihood from doing these things or selling things around. You know how it was with the temple in Jesus' time, where merchants would all come around the temple and use it as a market. These same things happened in this situation as well. So this was not easy, even for a king, to do something, especially when his predecessors had all been evil and done all these evil things, and then he's coming in and saying, no, we're not going to do that. He had to basically banish his mother or grandmother, whoever she was, because of her evil practices. So what about us in our day-to-day walk? And I'm thinking back, we're talking about today is the 3rd of July, the 4th of July, and the decline of America, decline of our country right now, and what does it take to turn it around? If we kind of sit on our hands and say, oh, woe is us, things are getting so bad, but yet that's not enough just to bemoan the situation. God wants us to act on his behalf, wants us to follow him, do what he has asked us to do. And as we see from Asa's situation, it's not going to be easy. There are battles to fight. There's going to be relationships that might be hurt because of it. But God's glory is above that. And trust in his will, as Asa did, is what's going to carry us through, and what can turn this country around if enough of us will be strong and stand up and not just be silent when bad things happen, when things that go against his will are allowed to happen until it becomes the norm. Because the things that happened, things that we thought were horrible, that everybody thought were horrible 30 years ago, it's like, we all do it. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Everybody does that. It's not bad. It's not really that bad. But Scripture says it's bad. It's bad. So that's what I hope we get from this about just being faithful to God, and no matter what circumstances we're put into, that if we trust in him and really try to focus on him, that our past doesn't have to be our future. It can turn into something else. All right, about that time, I guess. And is there any comments or questions about today? I know there's a lot of names that I butchered and all that kind of stuff while I was reading it, but hope you got the point, mainly about just Asa's faithfulness versus all the other kings of Israel and Judah, and the mess they made of things throughout the history of the two kingdoms. Wait, is there something else? Harry, would you pray?